I'd now like to introduce Ollie Costello, a Bundjalung man who has been heavily involved in the most recent 2021 State of the Environment report, which many of you will be aware was due to be released in 2021, but was somewhat delayed in its official release. I'm not sure how much Ollie will be allowed to talk about that, but he was a co-author of the chapter on extreme events and also involved in the first time that Indigenous co-authors were involved in the assessment report, and involved also in the Caring for Country section as well. So thank you, Ollie.
Thanks, David. Oh, it's very bright up here.
It is.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to try and juggle a bit here. Yeah, Jingala Blagamir. Hello, everyone. Nalina na jagun gandanja Monday nada gara gorbang bihang nangbangan. I just want to acknowledge country, our elders, past, present, and future. I've got to drive this myself. That's right. Yep. I'd also just like to acknowledge all the old people and just thank them for all the cultural knowledge that they've shared with me, and I guess many generations of people. In particular, I just want to acknowledge, there's lots of people to mention, but just in particular, my mother's late husband, Billy Yalawanga. He really inspired me. He literally got me off the couch and thinking about getting back out on country. And even before I saw this photo of this painting of found it years and years later after that old man inspired me, after I'd founded the Fire Sticks Initiative and Alliance. And so, yeah, and then I just saw this painting of the old man and just really brought home that kind of the knowledge. There's so much knowledge that gets shared. Sometimes it takes years and even decades for that to even be processed or even become apparent in your life. And it's so important to pay respect to those old people. I'm not going to go through all these hats. It's a little bit embarrassing, but it's just to give you a bit of a perspective of just all the different like hat wearing that often I have to do and many people have to do to try and just like do what we think is important on country and try and get the work done. And it can take a lot of time and take a bit of a toll at times trying to juggle all those hats and share those different perspectives. That light is really hectic. Because I just can't really see people, but yeah, I just like to sort of, and I'm going to do a bit of a SOE, and I'm going to have to get moving for the slides and a bit of caring for country stuff. And I just always like to talk about what are cultural values. And this is just a little sort of yarn that I do sometimes. This is my daughter, Jarly. She gets to star in a bit of my work. And she's standing next to a boogum, a black bean tree. It's a local rainforest tree on Bundjalung country. There's a whole yarn about, I can go into that. And it's just down up the hill from the little creek that I grew up in, and, you know, caught my first penny turtle and started learning connections to country and so the whole point, I guess, is around cultural values is that, you know, we've got family values that connect us, you know, we've got local, you know, values, and they mean different things to different people. For me, this boogum tree, you know, was a really special thing for me. It's a, you know, has a really important totemic relationship to that place and to my family story. And years later, once again, you know, I started learning about, you know, all the cultural stories, you know, the Dreamtime stories, creation stories that link to that species. It's a food resource, but it needs to be prepared properly because it's poisonous. And so you start to see there's all these layers at different levels, and we can't just kind of apply, you know, species relationships anywhere. We need to understand that local people have different relationships to country. And when we think about how we manage country, that's really important. And most of my work's been around fire, and this is not really a fire tree, but interestingly, you know, the way it was dispersed, the old people brought it into country. You know, it's only been in the landscape for maybe 5,000 or 7,000 years, and the old people bought it and they moved it through, and they moved through the fire pathways along the ridges. So even though it's not a fire tree, it has a link to a fire story. And whenever we're doing this, like thinking about that, we always need to understand those different relationships and always talk to local people about their connections. Do they eat them? Are they totems? Do they not eat them? Where do they belong in the landscape? What is healthy country? Not going to go into this too much, but about almost 10 years ago, we were working with a whole heap of rangers in the Northern Rivers, New South Wales, and we asked them why they burn, what was important to them. And interestingly, like if you ask a lot of people that, you know, live at the interface of fire or rural fire services and agencies why they burn, they'll often talk about fuel reduction and hazard reduction and life and property. But when we talk to rangers, it was very much more about the knowledge, being able to hand it on, looking after country, species. Like they were the things that were most important to them. And the ones at the top are the most important, and they sort of go down. Yeah, and what can we learn from cultural fire? You know, once again, it's not so much the typical things that people would always draw to. It's going to healing and lightning and landscape and community, the things that fire is teaching us. It's a much more deep understanding and connection to country and practice than just burning things. I'm going to brutally segue into extreme events. So yeah, as David mentioned, I was one of the co-authors of the report. I work with, I'll jump forward and do the acknowledgement. I work with Dan Metcalf, who's a director at CSIRO Oceans and Atmospheres. He led most of the report. I was really asked to talk about cultural fire and cultural land management. I end up writing a lot of the bushfire chapter and contributing to other parts of the report. And so this was the first report that had Indigenous co-authors. It also had, not for all the chapters, but for most of the ones that were relevant. And it also had artworks, Aboriginal artworks in all the chapters. So I just want to acknowledge Shane Pickett, the late Shane Pickett, who's a Noongar man, for this artwork that he created and that was used in the report that I co-authored. I'm just going to have to keep moving, I think, for time. I should read that out. Nalina Bilan Buwan Guan Buiwan Jingani Wirba Mandali Mara Bodharan. We learn from wind, rain, flood, lightning, hail, or fire. They teach us stories. Nalina Garama Li Jagun Jagun Garama Mibad. We care for country as country cares for us. And so that's a statement that I wrote with some of my uncles. I'm not very good at language. That's why I was trying to get better at it. But Uncle Rick and Marcus work with me on that. And it's the, you know, so this is now, in the reports, in the pages of history that we're getting our languages and our stories and our knowledge recognised. So it's really important to really honour, I guess, the old people's contributions to that work. Wrong way. Yeah, so why extreme events? This was the first time that extreme events was a chapter in the report, and I guess it's obviously because of the extreme events that we've had. We've seen not just climate change. Like climate change is obviously driving these massive extreme events, but I guess it's also a legacy of mismanagement of country. So I think it's always really important to understand that there's two things going on. But as we've seen, massive bushfires and more recently floods, which I've got a whole rave about, we're seeing that increase. And so it's, and the report's it's not a pretty report in the sense of what we're talking about. There's a lot of damage to heritage and culture and the infrastructure and community. So there's a lot of work to be done. Sorry, I keep going the wrong way. And so what are extreme events? So, Dan would normally do this bit and he's much better at this bit than me, but basically we're talking about, the ends, the extreme rain, flood, the extreme lack of rain, drought, so those kind of extreme variables on the edges of those variables, so, say for example, Lismore, it's flooded 150 times since they built the town there, so it's a flood space and floods are a naturally occurring event, quite positive, event in many circumstances when you look after the land and they're quite positive events. But when you clear all the land and you destroy the landscape and you put it all up into the atmosphere and you have a flood that's 2 meters higher than it's ever been before, pretty extreme event. And so that's what we're talking about, fires that raged across the East Coast and burnt whole clan estates, burnt unprecedented areas, well beyond anyone else's life experience, extreme events. And so we're seeing more of them, and they're getting worse as well. They're not new occurrences, they're just more extreme. So the frequency, intensity and distribution of extremes are changing. So we're seeing global temperature rise and will continue, sea level rise and continue, marine heat waves to be more frequent and intense, warmer with more heat waves and fewer cooler days, fewer tropical cyclones, but a greater proportion of them will be high intensity storms. And we're seeing cool season rainfalls decline in southeastern Australia, and that's going to continue. We're going through a La Nina at the moment, which is different to that, but that's the trend. We're seeing heavy rainfall become more intense. I saw the most intense rain that I've ever seen in my life up in the hills in Lismore, and seeing it with your own eyes, being, where I live, we had the heaviest rainfall during that time, and we live on a hill. It's all got to go down. But, seeing water well on hills, you know what I mean? That's pretty heavy rain, let alone when it gets to the bottom. And we're seeing longer fire seasons and more dangerous fire weather. And extreme events are compounding as well with other pressures. So we've got habitat fragmentation, clearing and devastation that we've seen across the landscape. That's compounding, like I said, with, all the trees, all the wetlands, all the forests are not there. So all the rain is running much quicker through the landscape, moving faster through the landscape. We've got invasive animals, invasive plants and water quality, inappropriate fire regime. So we're seeing these extreme events in this context of other things happening. So we're seeing more devastating impacts because of those other factors. And we're also seeing them coincide and be consecutive and compounding events. So we saw that in the cyclones and the floods. We saw it with the bushfires. We had a drought. We had trees dying, we had extreme fuel dryness, and then we saw fires come, and then we had floods. So we're getting erosion events and fish kills, and so this combination, that's more of the come. We also there's plenty more to come, and we also saw COVID as well as a part of that. So there's a whole heap of issues we need to think about, not just one extreme event, how a multiple factor of extreme events can cause more compounding issues. How are we going for time? Am I running out of time? Yep. Sorry. Yeah, I always get super nervous up on stage. Yeah, yeah, and I run. So I'll slow down. So yeah, I mainly talked about or wrote about the bushfires and the cultural fire management. So I'll sort of delve a bit more deeply into that. So 2019 was the hottest and the driest year on record. So, no surprise really that we had extreme fires following that. We had over 10 million hectares of native bushland burned, an estimated 1 to 3, so, between 1 and 3 billion animals killed or displaced. 34 people sadly lost their lives in the fires or fighting them. And we saw, and I guess the impact on cultural heritage and values hasn't been quantified. So we don't really know what's happened to lots of the cultural heritage values. There's some pretty poor government systems that monitor and have site registers and stuff. So we know a little bit, but we really have hardly any real way to quantify those impacts other than looking at what impacts happened over those 10 million hectares and the 1 to 3 billion animals. They're all cultural values too, but doing how to drill down and understand that's very hard. And that was one of the key deficits I felt from the State of Environment report. We couldn't really tell that story as well as it needed to be told. And climate change is obviously predicted to increase fire risk and impact. So what we saw is likely to happen again, sadly, in the future. So I guess a bit more of a positive note around cultural fire management. So, slides here. So Indigenous people have been practicing caring for country, which has included the use of fire for more than 65,000 years. Caring for country is more than using fire. It is a vast array of interconnected practices and relationships that are reciprocal in both tangible and intangible ways. These practices are learnt and regenerated through observation, interaction, ritual, storytelling, which help us to ground people in a sense of connection and awareness that we all come from and are always a part of country. By being present with purpose and learning with country, people can better understand their roles and relationships to caring for country. Indigenous people depend on country for their identity, survival, and well-being. People have a responsibility to care for country as she has cared for us and provides all that we have. Indigenous people's relationships with fire and the landscape have evolved over thousands of years of observation and practice, and it's critical for caring for country. Fire became a principal way for people to manage vegetation, food, medicine, and fibre in various types of country. There are well-established law practices in place to manage the landscape, including with fire before white settlers arrived. Some of the benefits of cultural burning. While most contemporary fire management practices are primarily focused on fuel management for hazard abatement, cultural burning extends far beyond this to incorporate a range of cultural, ecological, and community values and objectives, as I mentioned before. There are significant ecological and cultural benefits where Indigenous communities have been able to sustain or renew their cultural responsibilities to country. And we've seen that hugely, I guess, and I guess the revival of homelands and the range of programs, the Indigenous protected areas, now we've got huge parts of landscapes where those cultural practices have been restored, and we're seeing really massive benefits in livelihoods, in communities, employment, pride, sense of responsibility, but also species coming back, and huge benefits for the whole community. And so Indigenous fire management conducted early in the fire season in Northern Australia is a really good example, because it's helped reduce greenhouse gas emissions by reducing the likelihood and the severity and the extent of more destructive bushfires that result in significant emissions in late season fires. And that's only in the savannas, and so really hoping that more of that, that type of carbon management can be adopted in other parts of the country and increase the benefits of cultural land management. Almost there. Yeah, people, places, and cultural values. So extreme events are continuing the incremental destruction of Indigenous places and cultural values. And there's a growing recognition of the role Indigenous people can play in dealing with extreme events and mitigating these impacts. Significant areas of land are being returned, as I mentioned, through Indigenous protected areas and other forms of co-management and self-determination. And the Indigenous population is widespread and vulnerable. So many of our communities are, I guess, the most vulnerable to climate change, being, in remote areas and regional areas, often at the edge of service provision and infrastructure. But also the solutions, understanding of country, opportunities to transition, the huge workforce potential that we have in Aboriginal communities, transferring that human capital into transforming landscapes in a just transition. And so despite all that we've faced, all the colonisation and the destruction of our landscape, our people are super resilient. And that's a really important lesson, I think. Like it's been mentioned before, like I can take you to places back home where we can show you where the sea used to be, where the shoreline used to be, and we've got middens, we've got camping sites, we've got resources there. We know about climate change. We have that knowledge, and it's so important that we learn that knowledge and apply it in an adaptive management. There's new knowledge, there's new opportunities. And I guess the challenge that we have now is that the landscape, the climate change landscape issues are happening much faster. We have stories of people walking as sea waters and sea levels rose. We have stories of people walking when sea levels are rising in our oral histories, and we know that change is happening much faster now. So we have to look at not only our old ways but also our new ways of evolving our sense of responsibility, cultural protocols, and and really taking on that sense of purpose that's really critical for us to go forward together and understand the opportunities that we have to make change. Bugaware, Walla Walla, thank you for the opportunity to share. And just get in touch if you want to have a yarn sometime. I'll be here for the next couple of days. Beck and I will be speaking on Wednesday about conservation futures, which is about tackling some of the issues that I've mentioned today. So thank you, everyone.
Always. Thanks, Ollie, because that was really a great overview, not only of the State of the Environment report, but also caring for country and the value of fire management using traditional knowledge. It's really, really important. Thank you.